What's up, everyone? This is Paxton Pritchett from Everyday Mythos, here with my good friend, Jamie Revell. Jamie is the minister of Murray Christian Fellowship in Murray, Kentucky, and is in his doctoral program at a Midwestern seminary, I believe.
Yep.
Jamie, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Paxton.
Dude,
Glad to do this.
I'm so excited to do this too. This is our first dialogue here on Everyday Mythos. My hope and goal is to do some more of these with different scholars, Bible teachers, ministers, YouTubers, and kind of dialogue slash interview and talk about some different areas of theology, maybe some scholarship and the Bible. And hopefully this will be used to minister to the church, to learn more knowledge about church history and different theological ideas.
Yeah.
So this past year, Jamie, we've been some good friends, and I hope we continue to be good friends. Obviously,
we'll see how the
interview goes. We'll be like, oh, you're of that system of theology. Not friends.
That didn't come out until just this moment.
You're not a real Christian. And for what we've learned though, and hung out together, you've been doing a study on the canon of Scripture. So this has been a very passionate part of your life these past couple months, and I've learned a lot under you from this. And today I was really hoping we would talk about basically the New Testament canon and how it relates to some of the earliest post-biblical Christians. So like we all know, if you believe in a conservative look at church history, that you have Jesus, our Lord and Savior, God become man. He comes to earth, has a ministry of approximately 3 years, and then ascends into heaven 30-ish, maybe?
Yeah, 33.
33. And so then the apostles, the church has been born on earth, so to speak, and they start spreading the gospel to all nations and founding churches. And our question is, once the apostles died out, they were persecuted and passed away, what were some of those earliest Christians that wrote stuff down? What was their look at the New Testament? And this is an area, from what I've learned, of kind of controversy in scholarship, academia, and just people's lives. So, Jamie, tell us a little bit about what are these church fathers, and especially the Apostolic fathers, and like, what do those words mean? A lot of Christians maybe go to church and they don't interact with what we call the church fathers, especially in the low church community.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That was my most valuable coaster, by the way.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have a couple of different things that we can sort of set the table with this group called the Apostolic Fathers, and it's sort of the name is kind of a confusing name in a sense, because you have the apostles, right? And when you're talking about the Apostolic Fathers, you're not talking about the apostles.
I know, right?
But you're talking about their disciples.
Because I remember when I used to be a youth minister, I would call the apostles like fathers of the church, or the church fathers, and it's like now I've learned like, oh, that term doesn't apply to the apostles. Like, my knowledge is kind of a different group. And then the Apostolic Fathers, that kind of also makes it confusing because they aren't the apostles, even though the word apostolic's in the name.
Yeah, so, I mean, sometimes you'll read different history, like church history textbooks, and different authors might play around with different titles, like maybe the sub-apostolic age or something like that, to try to avoid confusion on this. But you've already sort of set the stage here when we talk about canon, that you've got the creation of this early church that's founded by the disciples or the apostles, right?
Right.
And what's fascinating is that when you read the New Testament with basically a historical lens, what you see are very practical problems in the churches that they're dealing with. And so we see in some of the pastoral letters, for example, or Colossians, we see different things where, or even Galatians, where Paul is combating heresy on one side, and really trying to deal with some of these problems. But then guys like Paul also list a lot of the people that they're discipling within their works. And so yeah, I'm sending this person to you, greet them in the Lord, that type of language. So basically, what you get is a vision that the early church was founded in a historical context, and the apostles were deliberately making disciples. They were investing in a group of people themselves to inherit the church, so to speak. Yeah, so you've got kind of this interesting situation. Then the apostolic fathers are basically those inheritors.
Really?
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I'd be happy to to
Okay.
talk about maybe what these different apostolic fathers look like. Is there anything so far that you've
Yeah, so let's see. I can't think of too much off the top of my head, but so basically,
yeah
the apostolic fathers. So if we have a conservative view of church history, we got
right
Jesus as the head and founder of the church, so to speak,
sure.
in that he, or maybe not, but yeah, he's our Lord and Savior.
Mhm.
Then you have the apostles who were under him,
Right.
who learned from him, saw his risen body,
Mhm.
and they kind of go out and spread the gospel to all nations is their desire. That's the desire of Jesus for them.
Sure.
Go and make disciples of all nations. And
Mhm.
then the apostolic fathers are kind of like their disciples and those who were
Mhm.
discipled by them or have a close connection to them.
Right.
And it's not kind of that, I don't know if maybe next generation is the right word, but in a way it's like the next part of church history going forward. What would you call like the dates of the apostolic fathers? Like the church was probably founded AD 30 with Jesus rising from the dead and ascending to heaven in Pentecost, or AD 33. And when is the apostolic fathers age?
Yeah, so really the canon closes uh about 96 AD with Revelation, right? And you actually have a little bit of overlap here into the apostolic father age, where Revelation is suggested to have been written, or at least it's a fairly common date to say it's around 96. Clement, or First Clement, there are multiple Clements,
Right.
which adds to confusion. But Clement of Rome,
Clement of Rome.
right? He is said to have written his letter to the church in Corinth around 95 AD. And you've got a whole bunch of different letters, Polycarp, Ignatius. You've got different works that are around maybe 110-ish. And then you've got a whole body of apostolic fathers that are really like the first 50 years ish
Okay.
of the second century.
Okay.
So if you're trying to categorize this in your mind, you could think of John handing the baton off to somebody, okay. At really the end of the first century. And it's that first generation of that first 50 years, right?
Yeah.
Of the second century.
So it's kind of like the New Testament church, quote unquote, lasts from around like 80 30s to the 90s with the completion of Revelation.
Right.
And then from there, we kind of start with a little overlap, the Apostolic Fathers.
Right.
And their literature that they produced.
Right.
So who are some of these apostolic fathers? Like if someone was to say what's the literature of the apostolic era? Who are the people of the apostolic fathers? What is like some of their bios?
Yeah, so you can approach this. I like to think of it as maybe like solar systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, like as an analogy, you can come up with different ways of comparing or sorting these different guys, but basically you've got some people who are connected to John.
Ooh.
Some people who are connected maybe closer with Paul, right? And then you've got a whole bunch of different works that are sort of individual works that they don't stand neatly in a category, but they fall within the date range. They're really taken up by the early church, such as the Shepherd of Hermas. Yeah, that would be an example of one that it's not really neatly connected to Peter or Paul or James or some of these different early church apostles.
Gotcha.
but it falls within the era, and so it's normally counted, right? Clement is a great person to start with.
Wait, let's start with him. Who is Clement of Rome?
Yeah, so Clement of Rome, it's interesting because basically we have this letter of his that's sent to the church in Corinth, and he is highly familiar with Paul's writing to the church in Corinth. And in fact, he says, he talks about how it was, he's like, it's almost acceptable in my mind that you were having disputes when Paul wrote to you, because the people that you were disputing over were, Paul and Apollos and Peter, like you were disputing over apostles, or people that the apostles approved. But now that the situation that he's writing to is that basically the church had ousted the leaders of the church.
Okay.
There was
kind of a congregation uprising.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and so Clement is like, you're doing the same stuff that Paul had reproved you for.
Interesting. So that seems to be like you're really concreting Paul's letter in history.
Right.
Because you have, and I might be stealing your thunder here.
No, it's fine.
But it's like you have in the 90s, perhaps, if that's when Clement wrote this letter.
Yeah.
He's writing in Rome to the church of Corinth and saying basically maybe something like, hey, back in the day, y'all had these disputes with Paul, which would have been, or disputes when Paul wrote to you.
Yeah.
And that would have been like, what, 50 years ago for them?
Right.
And so that puts it in history, because like if that didn't actually happen, Clement wouldn't actually write that letter and say that in his letter if this is an actual letter to Corinth.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating for multiple reasons. And I'll throw out just a couple.
Yeah.
One of them is that Clement in his letter, he talks about in detail the things that were part of 1 Corinthians.
Really?
And he says, you should go back. Actually, this is something that a lot of the Apostolic Fathers do, is that they say, you should go back and reread that letter. And the implication of what's being said is, I know what's in the letter. Yeah, and you need to go back and read it. Or to make it more obvious, there seems to be a shared connection to the letter, or if I know the details so intimately of the letter that was sent to you, there's a good chance that I possess it. Right. A lot of Paul's letters were designed to be circulatory. Right. And there are different, actually, important facets of this conversation, such as Roman letter writing standard practices. I'll throw out just an idea here. If you're writing something, well, how about this? If you're doing something today, and let's just say that you're working for a business, okay? Let's just say that your business hires you to go out and purchase
milk.
That
was me when I used to work at Starbucks.
Okay.
They'd be like, here's the credit card, go get milk.
Okay. Were you required to keep receipts?
Yes.
Yeah, 100%, right?
We'd be in trouble if we
Yeah. So you keep receipts if you're going out and making business transactions. There are lots of situations in old ancient Roman letter writing where basically an important thing would be written and then copied.
Okay.
Immediately.
So we have 2 copies of the letter.
Yeah, or more. Yeah, so I mean, you could have upwards of, it depends on how many parties are involved. This is to say, like, it wouldn't be shocking to have six original copies.
Wow.
Right. Yeah, so this is fascinating for a number of reasons. One, is that when you start talking about autographs and like original writings of the New Testament, um, most people would probably recognize that there's more than one copy, or more than one quote unquote autograph of each New Testament letter in circulation. So this is to say that Clement, one way or the other, it seems pretty evident in his work, as well as several other apostolic fathers, that they possess a copy.
Interesting.
Of First Corinthians, or fill in the blank, and they expect that their audience does too.
Wow.
To the point that I can say, if I'm Clement, you need to go back and reread this and pay attention to this detail.
So from First Clement, this letter that was written probably in the 90s, we can learn that Clement had a copy of First Corinthians.
Right.
Corinth had a copy of First Corinthians. And the incidents of First Corinthians are grounded in actual events that happened.
Right. Yeah.
Which would help prove that Paul actually wrote First Corinthians to an actual place.
Yeah, it would lend credibility to it for sure. Yeah, so you've got some really, I think, important ideas that are grounded in the Apostolic Father data, the biblical data. There are other things too. This is maybe less. This is more of a debated point.
Okay.
But there are also some interesting factors, like First Clement or Clement of Rome is potentially mentioned in Paul's letters.
Interesting.
Or specifically Philippians. Philippians 4 mentions Clement.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
And do you think maybe like do you have like a speculation? Like you say it's hot, like it's kind of contested, but like if you had to die on a hill, like would you say?
So I like the idea of this Clement being that Clement. Of course, you could have multiple Clements.
Right.
That's
probably not like a unique name that someone was like, "Your name's Clement? I never heard that before."
Yes,
maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, one of the things, traditionally, there are a couple of maybe factors that could lend credence to it being the same Clement. One of which would be that Paul, when he wrote Philippians and he mentioned Clement, that's one of Paul's prison letters.
Right, in Rome.
In Rome.
Which is where Clement of Rome is at, obviously.
And he's acting as some sort of leader at that point.
Interesting.
So there's at least a lineage that you could possibly trace and say, okay, well, maybe this is that exact same Clement. This is not something that's universally accepted across scholarship. That this is the exact same Clement. However, it's just data. It's data that we possess.
You can work it into at least thinking like, if this is the case, what are the implications and things like that.
Sure.
It's fun to work with.
Yeah.
So if Clement is one of these church apostolic fathers, he wrote First Clement, probably in the 90s, perhaps, and so that's one of them. Who else is there? So is he kind of in the Paul solar system?
Yeah, he would be in the Paul solar system. I think that later writers maybe try to put him in the Peter solar system.
Really?
Yeah, I think that I'd have to double check this, but I feel like Eusebius does.
And for our listeners who don't know who Eusebius is, he's the church historian.
Yeah, he's church historian, 4th century.
I gotcha. Neat.
Yeah.
So what other solar systems are there? Like, what about John's solar system?
Yeah, so John's solar system is bigger. And you've got a couple of different guys in that solar system. One of whom is, or really the big one is Ignatius. Yes. And Ignatius writes 7 letters. 6 of them are to churches, 1 of them is to Polycarp. And then you have 1 letter of Polycarp to the church at Philippi.
Okay.
And then possibly also added to this is maybe Papias. And Papias is his own. That's he's his own like weird duck of the John solar system of apostolic writings. But this is really the situation that we seem to possess. First off, there's a writer. He writes a book called Against Heresies. His name's Irenaeus, right? And he writes that around 180.
Okay.
And in Against Heresies, he claims that he is the disciple of Polycarp, and that Polycarp was the disciple of John.
Wow.
Okay. And there's some really interesting things about this writing. And one of them is that Polycarp remembered the days of John talking about Jesus.
Wow.
So you've got
you
kind of at least Irenaeus is pushing this position to say we are connected directly to
the risen Savior.
Correct.
So that's so cool. Like, that's so fascinating with these early disciples that they can trace their discipled lineage, like how we as humans have lineages, like I'm the son of Judd, who's the son of James.
Right.
You can have your discipled lineage where it's like they can trace, like Irenaeus can say, I was discipled by Polycarp, who was discipled by John, who's discipled by Jesus.
Yeah.
So I think a skeptic, or perhaps maybe a more liberal critical scholar, may look at that and be like, how can you believe that? Like, is that true? Like, what are your thoughts on, like, when people might say that, like, well, maybe Irenaeus was bluffing, or maybe Ignatius or maybe Polycarp was bluffing?
Sure. No, that's an interesting point. So my mind jumps to a couple different things. One of them is we'll start with Irenaeus, because Irenaeus, I just mentioned him. He's a good place to start. Irenaeus has a bunch of his book is called Against Heresies. So he's got target heretics such as a group called the Valentinians. He's got a bunch of target groups of heretics, quote unquote, in his day and age that, and maybe you actually take away those quotes. Heresy.
Okay. I'm about to say, you're about to be so it turns out, Jamie, you are a closeted Valentinian.
Anyway. It's unfortunate air quotes.
You do it, and you're like, why did I do that? Okay. Actual heretics.
Anyway, Irenaeus is writing against the Valentinians, and for a very long time, it was assumed actually that Irenaeus was really like straw manning. He was straw manning the Valentinians. That basically what we possessed of Valentinian belief was through Irenaeus.
Right. Kind of like these, because these heretical groups died off. And so none of their writings survived, quote unquote, or at least for the longest time. And so basically, would you say people are like, well, the only things we know about these guys are from their enemies?
Right.
Which then makes it like, how can we really trust? Like, maybe you're straw manning or accusing them of stuff that they didn't actually do.
Right. So one of the things that's interesting, and a good writer on this, his name's Bruce Metzger, and he's got a book on the Canon and its development. It's a very short, it's a small book. But one of the things that he points out is that when Valentinian writings, as well as just other heretic writings, were discovered at Nag Hammadi, that it turns out, actually, Irenaeus's accounts for what Valentinians believed was incredibly accurate. And the fascinating point in all of this was that if Irenaeus was willing to treat his enemies with precision, what about smaller details that were what we would call non-offensive or non-offensive details, right? If he's willing to be honest with with how he deals with his enemies, what about some of these other points? It lends credence to maybe some of his historical writing.
And it's almost like, I'm not saying that, oh, Irenaeus, everything he says is true. I'm not saying that necessarily, but part of me wonders, why is it that, like, and this is more just a rabbit trail. Like, it kind of makes you wonder why, like, everyone questions everything positive about the early church.
Yeah.
You know, like what if maybe, just maybe, they're actually telling the truth, or at least what they think the truth is. Like,
sure,
maybe they aren't malevolent people.
Yeah, well, and this is an important idea, right?
Yeah.
That and we started here actually, was that from the early church inception, what you had was a situation where Paul is writing against heretics,
Yeah.
right? So you take Galatians as an example, and Galatians 1, Paul is saying, if anyone were to preach another gospel to you, not that there is another gospel, but if this is a man or even an angel from heaven, that person is to be accursed or cut off. And so what's fascinating is, and there are all sorts of different places where it seems very evident that you had what we might call an orthodox stream.
Yeah.
And this is actually a popular conversation. The conversation larger is what we would call orthodoxy before Irenaeus.
Yes.
And really the concept here is that by the time of Irenaeus makes thousands of New Testament citations.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, just like he has a very full citation of the New Testament
without Google.
Yeah,
I'd be like, what verse says X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, no, and that's actually that's a good point. So,
this is actually off topic. My computer's getting super hot. Can I put it right here?
100%.
My lap's like.
I actually want you to put your very hot computer on my chessboard.
Is that sarcasm?
No.
Okay,
no, of course not.
It's like, no, I want you to keep burning it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yeah, you were saying, so Irenaeus quotes the New Testament thousands of times.
Right.
Wow, that is so fascinating right there.
Yeah, so really the question that a lot of people ask is not... so generally the presentation is that Irenaeus is... Or at least within certain maybe more critical groups, is that Irenaeus was the quote unquote winner, or the quote unquote orthodox champion. Yeah.
This takes us to a really cool part I was hoping we'd talk about Christianity's plural.
Okay, so why don't you frame the question, frame the idea, and we'll talk about it.
From my understanding, I'm not a scholar. I'm just an armchair guy, quite literally, with this armchair.
Yeah.
Loving to look into this stuff. And from what I've learned from people, from channels that are more on the critical side, like not Christian, is that they really love to talk about how in scholarship there's this idea of Christianity's plural.
Right.
Almost like, from my perspective, you have a bunch of different groups that all claim to be Christian, and almost like maybe instead of there being one specific right group and the rest are these wrong groups, there's almost like, hey, we need to give more credence to these other groups. And like they're all at war to be the true Christianity or the right Christianity. And basically, the only reason maybe that we are Orthodox today is because that's the group that won.
Sure.
So, like, maybe, like, if the Valentinians won, we would all be Valentinians or something. Yeah. Do you think I'm wording the question or the statement all right?
Yeah, that's a fair... I think that's a fair presentation or idea.
So, what are your thoughts on that idea of, like, multiple Christianities going on?
Sure.
And should we give... What type of validity do you think we should give to those other groups? Because there's a lot. Like, I was shocked almost by just how many groups there are.
Yeah.
In that early first couple hundred years of Christianity. And so, like, I think a lot of people in today's world, they want to call all those groups Christian, and how colorful Christianity was. Like, I was watching a video a couple days ago by Gnostic Informant. Small shout out to him. Not that I endorse him in his beliefs, but he basically said that the difference in theology, like the differences between early Christian groups, is more varied in his opinion than the difference between a Catholic and a Mormon. And from his video and from other things I've looked at, there's so many different groups that all seem to claim Jesus. Like, we have groups that are called Gnostics, such as the Valentinians and the Sethians and the other things that I don't even remember the names of. Sure. And then you have groups that are very Jewish in nature, so to speak, like the Ebionites.
Right.
And so you have all these different groups that are kind of vying to be Christian of sorts. And then you have proto-orthodoxy, which is like the guys we've been talking about. And they're the ones that won the day, so to speak.
Sure.
And so what do you think about that idea and how that relates to your views on church history and that we've been talking about?
Yeah. So why don't we can maybe start with what are the things about that view that are maybe accurate?
Ooh, I like that.
Okay, yeah. You start with what's accurate and then you move into what's not. So I think that it would be fair, right, to recognize that there, as with any age, there's diversity of thought.
Right.
Right. Not every Christian, even in today's society, is identical in and every dot and T.
That's right.
So to say that there's an orthodox stream, quote unquote, does not mean that orthodox stream doesn't even present variation within the stream. For example, if you get into the 200s, one guy that he's often labeled as a heretic now, but he would be maybe considered as part of the more quote unquote mainstream would be Origen.
Yeah.
Right. And that Origen, what's interesting is that Origen's own writings actually ended up being very important for the creation of some of our most important biblical manuscripts.
Wow.
So, for example, if you were to go to Sinaiticus, which is, it's a 4th century full Bible manuscript or codex, right? Origen's writing is used, or Origen's translations and manuscripts were used in the production of that. Cool. Yeah, and so there's some interesting conversations here about just saying, some of these guys that were maybe later criticized or maybe were divergent from mainstream belief in some regards. There's still, I think that there's orthodoxy, but with diversity, right? But then there are groups that really slap the sticker of Christian on their shirt, and the church is like, basically has to say, no, that's a completely false belief, right? And this, going back to, even the New Testament roots, this is something that the apostles themselves are very clear about. Right? Is that there are groups that were attempting to even write or maybe even claim that they were Paul writing a letter, or they were, this is the sort of thing where, from the church's inception, there were groups that were attempting to divert or change the foundational gospel. And so that appears in the New Testament, and it doesn't change. Those groups continue to persist into the Apostolic Fathers age. And I keep returning to Irenaeus. I know that you're wanting to talk about Apostolic Fathers and stuff.
And he's like right afterwards, right?
Yeah, he's right after, and he's connected.
He's important to the conversation because he is a disciple of an Apostolic Father.
Right. And he's not the only one. Tertullian does this. I think Hippolytus does this as well. In dealing with basically Gnostic or heretical, other heretical groups. one of the things that they do that's very interesting is they pull receipts.
Mm.
So Irenaeus says one controversy that appears in Irenaeus's writing is whether the number of whether the number in Revelation or the mark of the beast is 666 or is it 616.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's funny is that this heretical, this seems like almost like a non-issue to us. It's like, okay, why are you duking it out over a number,
one number,
right? And basically, Irenaeus he pulls receipts and he says, we possess the ancient writings.
Mm.
We possess the old manuscripts. And these other groups do not. Right. And that's actually something that the early church does, is they ask the question, are you connected to the Apostolic Fathers? Are you connected to a church with a history, or not? This is to say that I think that there are things that view maybe does well, but there are things that it fails to recognize, which is, one, the orthodoxy of the early church, right? And then really that strong apostolic record, that carries through. So it seems to me that when you're playing around with this, that what you have is what you would call maybe an orthodox stream, and that there can be even variation within that stream, but a general orthodox stream. But then you've got groups outside that are trying to change or alter.
From my knowledge, from my gnosis, see what I did there? Gnosis is knowledge, Gnostic. So from my knowledge of this subject, it's like everyone, it feels like different groups are trying to be the heir apparent of the church, almost. Like, at least they're trying to be perhaps the true church in a way.
Yeah.
Like, for example, or at least they want to try to get themselves up to the foundation.
Right.
So, like, for example, the Valentinians, Valentinus, according to Origen, I've heard, was discipled by someone who was discipled by Paul. So he kind of has a stream up there. And Marcion, I think, might have the same thing. Or at least he tries
connection to Mark.
Oh, Marcion claimed connection to Mark?
Maybe I'm wrong.
Okay, well...
Yeah, anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
There might be something with Marcion as well. And I know the Ebionites, they at least think James was, like, the main disciple. And Paul's like, no. While Marcion's kind of like, Paul's the disciple, the good one, and the rest are kind of no-nos. And so, like, they try to latch on to different early church things. And with Valentinus, perhaps even having a connection up there. And so perhaps you might try to use those as saying, hey, they have some validity to them. But what's so cool is there's a much bigger cloud of witness for the proto-Orthodox Apostolic Fathers. So, like, if we're trying to go, which one seems to be more reliable and closer to the actual apostles and Jesus Christ, is it the proto-Orthodox group, which might be Ignatius, Polycarp, Clement, or is it the Valentinians, or is it the Sethians, or is it the Ebionites? It seems that the proto-Orthodox have the best bet. Like, if you're going to try to bet on which one actually is closest to what the apostles taught, it seems to be them.
Yeah. And that's a fair point, and I'll backtrack. I've got a loose thought about this, that there is a tradition. It's a Gnostic tradition of basically Mark, a connection with Mark in Egypt. But I would have to retract that. For that comment. But anyway, moving back to the point that you were just on. Yeah, it's actually remarkable. If you look at some of the Apostolic Fathers like Ignatius, right, that you get what we might call extremely Orthodox or extremely, maybe quote-unquote, normal Christianity from his different letters. and he's speaking pastorally. Yeah, the
Mhm.
context of his situation
Right.
is that he's en route to be martyred.
Wow.
Yeah, and so some of his writings is, he's saying, pray for me that I die well. I'm going to be
Mm.
eaten by beasts. I don't want to recant my faith in the last moment. That type of thing.
That's so fascinating right there.
It is. Well, and, I mean, it speaks to really the tremendous weight of what it meant to be a Christian,
Mm.
right, in that period, or during persecution, right. Um, but within his letters, uh, we can pull many statements
Mm.
that we would say that still aligns
Mm.
with what Christians believe today.
Mm.
Whether that's the crucifixion, the resurrection, there's all sorts of basically standard Christian
Mm.
beliefs that are
Wow.
woven into Ignatius's work. Same thing with Polycarp.
Yeah. That is
Yeah.
so fascinating. And so, from my perspective, it feels like we have perhaps a beautiful stream of we have these Ignatius, Polycarp, and these people who seem to be taught by the apostles, and they seem to use the New Testament.
Hmm.
And then the apostles, like having that link between the two, I think that's really cool and helps show some validity to the New Testament and the authors of the New Testament, grounding them in historical evidence and historical things. Like
Hmm.
some people, they might try to push, and this kind of goes on to the idea of how they use the New Testament. Some people like try to give the New Testament a very liberal later dating.
Right.
And so I know that you're not one of those people. And
Hmm.
let's move that conversation over there. So like in how do these apostolic fathers use the New Testament? Like, because some people might even try to put New Testament books post the apostolic fathers, or maybe they push the apostolic fathers way back.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're trying to argue for like second century dating on
Yeah.
on the New Testament, it's just wrong.
Okay.
Like it's one thing to argue for Matthew being like post 70,
Right.
like after the destruction of the temple. That's an idea that's played around with in different scholarship.
Mm.
But to make an argument or something that is very very late, like second century late,
Right.
that would be patently false, right? So it anyway, this is to say, like, when we're talking about 27 books of the New Testament, obviously there's lots of data, obviously there's lots of
Yeah.
different contours to this conversation. But with the Apostolic Fathers, um, a couple of notes that you can make. One is there's no substitute for reading. Yeah, like,
Right.
and encouragement to listeners, right? If there's no substitute for actually sitting down and reading the old book.
Yeah.
Read the Apostolic Fathers; they'll be edifying to you.
Well,
Yeah,
what recommendation? Like, what translate? Do you have a translation you like, or like a website that we can go to look at that?
that's a good question. So honestly, I really like, you talk about Penguin Classic books and
Penguin
stuff.
classic book. Yeah.
Penguin Classics has an early Christian writings
Ooh,
book
fascinating.
that includes all sorts of different writings. It includes Polycarp. It includes all of Ignatius's letters.
Ooh.
I think it includes the Didache.
Ooh.
There's lots of
Yeah.
different books. Anyway, uh, so I would look into him. I think that Rick Brannon has translations on the Apostolic Fathers. He's pretty good. Um, and you can actually pull them up. They're public domain, so you can get maybe less quality translations, but available free online.
Nice.
Anyway, a lot of these guys, and this is an important point whenever you're thinking about Apostolic Fathers, is that they're not trying to prove a list.
Mm.
Okay. So thinking about the canon, so many people come at the conversation of canon as like a list, a list that was um, contrived,
Mm.
right, at the end of the fourth century.
Yeah.
And I'd mentioned Bruce Metzger earlier. Metzger is quoted as saying, that the canon is not an authoritative list of books.
Yeah.
It's a list of authoritative books. If you detect the difference between those two statements, one of them is to say that the list was authoritative. The others are to say that the books are authoritative. If God were to breathe one book into creation, the canon would be one book. That's the idea. So, anyway, whenever you're looking at the Apostolic Fathers and you're trying to think about this conversation of canon, what you're doing is you're engaging in what's called a functional view of the canon, which is to ask the question, what were the books that the early church used in their churches, in their liturgy, in their writing, that sort of thing? And the Apostolic Fathers, guys like Ignatius, Ignatius quotes so much of the New Testament.
Interesting.
But he's not trying to prove a list.
Yeah.
It's like what I like to think of is that he speaks and writes in maybe what we would call a New Testament dialect. This is someone who's been so saturated in the New Testament that phrases flow out of Ignatius in ways where it's like, okay, this guy very clearly has had lots of contact with what we would call the New Testament.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And it really solidifies that opinion of it actually being the New Testament when you look at stuff like Clement actually mentioning 1 Corinthians.
Right.
Like, this isn't just some random, like, maybe they came up with these phrases. Like, oh, these books actually seem to be in existence, at least with 1 Corinthians.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, that's so fascinating. Like, how they're using these and, like, they're not trying to prove it. Like, it's not like Ignatius is saying, all right, y'all, there's been some controversy here, but these are the 27 books that we believe in. Instead, it's just almost maybe like an assumption. Like, I assume these are the one. Like, this is authoritative almost.
Yeah. Well, and we had talked about this. Like I had mentioned, Clement saying, go back and read the book, or go back and read the letter that the blessed Apostle Paul sent you. Polycarp does the same thing with the church at Philippi.
Ooh.
Yeah, and he says you should read the letter that Paul sent you.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So whenever you're combing through these guys, like there are moments where the letters themselves and the churches that would have received them are explicitly listed and said. Wow. But more often it's implicit. It's and you get into this is a more like fine-tuned conversation. And the question is, when you're talking about functional use of the canon, what counts as a citation? Of a New Testament work. So basically, you've got tiers of possible citation. One of them's direct quotation. Is to say, as it is written, and then I quote verbatim what we possess.
Kind of like Paul saying, like for the Old Testament, as it is written, the just shall live by faith, or something like that.
Sure. Right. So you were to take that, and the intention is direct quotation.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's paraphrased, right? So, and the paraphrase here would be to say that you have a similar formula, and actually what you just referenced would be would maybe work with a paraphrase in the sense like if there is a minor change.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So like I think that Habakkuk is it? Yeah. I think Habakkuk 2:4.
Something like, I think it's in the 2s. Yeah, Habakkuk 2 early on.
Yeah. So Paul's reference of that in Romans, right?
Yeah.
That if you were to take the Septuagint of Paul's citation, it would be the righteous shall live by my faith, or the righteous shall live by faith in me.
Interesting.
Yeah. But Paul cites the righteous shall live by faith.
Wow.
And there is a so this is to say, like, in that situation we would say, okay, Clearly, the reference is intended. Clearly, the reference has uh, close parallels with the original text. That's probably a citation of this thing, right? The Apostolic Fathers, looking back to the New Testament, works in much the same way. If we have, and I could probably pull something up in just a second, but we have situations where um, a citation is made, but the there's either been a flopping in the verse, like guy quotes the beginning of the verse last and the end of the verse first, like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is to say that when you're dealing in that would still be clearly an apostolic father reference to the New Testament. We know what you're trying to do.
Right.
The fact that you're writing maybe on the road, or maybe you're writing while you're staying at some place or whatever. Yeah. And you're remembering.
Kind of like if you're preaching a sermon and you're bringing up a verse that you didn't write down and just paraphrasing it, kind of.
Sure. Yeah, so that would be it. The paraphrase is something that we can look at and say, okay, yes, the quotation's intended. It's just kind of off the cuff.
Yeah.
And then you have what we might call an echo. And an echo can be something that's smaller, or maybe you'd call it an allusion. Okay. And this category of citation for functional usage would be like the one that's pretty common in the Apostolic Fathers is talking about Jesus as the high priest. Okay. We really only see the high priest language used in Hebrews.
Interesting.
Right. Yeah, so there's that question of, okay, why are these guys calling Jesus high priest? Okay. This is to say that amongst scholars, the breadth of the canon is disputed on the basis of what counts as a citation.
Right.
A good work to maybe look into this, like, and maybe like just get into the initial survey of these arguments if you're interested in looking this up. It's Michael Kruger. The Question of Canon. He's got a book that's
interesting,
really solid on this.
Is he related to Freddy Krueger? Okay, just check.
Okay. Yeah, so anyway, that's a book that would be maybe helpful for diving deeper into some of these conversations.
Yeah.
But that being said, as you work in through this, what you actually get maybe in touch with is that the breadth of the New Testament that the Apostolic Fathers possessed is pretty wide. It's a pretty significant canon.
What are some of the main books they focus on, like that you kind of see allusions to / paraphrase / perhaps quotation?
It depends on the author.
Okay.
So you see a lot from Galatians, 1 Corinthians. Okay. I actually think that you can make an argument. You can make an argument for almost across the Apostolic Fathers, like every single one.
So even Ignatius, Polycarp,
right,
Barnabas, Shadrach, Hermas, etc.
Yeah, I think that you can make you can make an argument for an exceptionally wide canon that's almost completely full. I don't think that I've come across. So there's some questions that and caveats and things like that of like, do you load in like books like 1st through 3rd John? Do you think of that as like one set of books, or like so there's not tons and tons of it. You have to think about occasion for writing and occasion for citation, and again, you're not trying to prove that you know a book.
Right.
So the occasion for citing 3rd John, just as an example. So I think that Jude, 3rd John, those books are cited less, if not absent. Right, from the Apostolic Fathers. However, you can make pretty decent arguments for a much broader corpus, maybe up to the 25 of the 27.
Ooh,
Wow. Yeah, now some of them are much better arguments than others.
right.
Right.
So if we take a very like generous argument, we could basically say that almost the entire New Testament is known by the church the apostolic
Right. It
fathers.
depends on how generous you want to be.
Right. So like if you want to be more or less generous,
If you want to be less generous, it's obviously smaller.
right.
Yeah. So, and again, I would definitely refer you to uh, read the Apostolic Fathers yourself. And you have to be kind of New Testament savvy to pick up on citations. Bruce Metzger's book on Canon, Michael Kruger's book on Canon. These guys, you comb through all sorts of really like what we would call strong citations.
Sweet.
So books like Matthew, First Corinthians, Galatians, they come through really strong. John comes through.
It's so cool.
It's really good.
So I got two questions I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
Okay.
And both of these I think we're to finish off to like land the plane. Let's go into more
Okay.
Maybe practicality for our lives.
Okay.
Us as Christians who are 2,000 years about removed from these fascinating books, how can the way that they are using the New Testament, this idea, if we're generous with them and we're looking at the Apostolic Fathers as having copies of New Testament books, how can that, you think, help us apologetically for trusting the faith that we believe was once for all handed down, so to speak?
Sure. Well, and I think that you could maybe start off by think about what's the center? What's the center of the faith, right? Or what's primary, what's secondary, what's most important. I think that if you're talking about importance center out, you're talking about Jesus walking on this earth, dying a real death on a cross, being really raised from the dead. That you've got a crucified and risen Savior.
Right. Who is pre-existent as well, if I'm right.
Yeah.
Like Ignatius, I'm pretty sure talks about Jesus as creator of the world.
Yeah, so I would have to go back through
it. That was just a long time ago.
Sure, yeah. But this would be to say that if you're working through and thinking about what's the center of your faith, obviously the point of this conversation is to affirm the canon and affirm that the canon's good, right? And that you can trust it. And I think that would be actually a decent take home of the conversation, would be to say, okay, yeah, you really, and this is a more, this conversation is bigger than what we can get whipped in an hour and a half.
Absolutely, yeah. Much more complicated.
But that being said, one of the conversations that comes up or arises is, okay, sure, we want you to be confident in the canon that you possess. However, I think that maybe a better starting point is to say we have the early consistent attestation that Jesus was who he said he was.
That's so cool.
Right.
Do you think that the Apostolic Fathers did have the same faith once for all? Like, do you think that they had the same gospel overall? Like, I'm sure there's like little differences maybe, but like same way of salvation, overall same view maybe, or at least a view that maybe not as much expressed yet, but a similar view on Jesus' divinity and humanity and things like that. Salvation, theology of Christ, things like that. Do you think it seems?
Yeah, so that would be where we would point out and say, okay, if you read through these guys, you might come into conflict, maybe if you've got specific views of how the Lord's Supper works or how baptism works, or like if you've got certain views of liturgy, you might, or if you've got certain views of how works interact with faith. These are things that I think create very interesting theological conversations from the Apostolic Fathers. However, if you're talking about what's the center, Jesus being fully God, fully man, really crucified, really raised. um, is present and affirmed.
Wow.
Yeah. So
So, and the last question is, how do you think the church fathers, like for the apostolic fathers, for us today, how do you think they can be encouraging to us?
yeah,
Like, to sit down and read them and things.
yeah. So we had talked about this earlier. One of the things that's real edifying to me uh, is reflecting on one circumstance. We talked about Ignatius writing
Mm.
about wanting to keep the faith, and wanting to be true to Christ even unto death.
Ooh,
Right?
yeah.
That he believed that Jesus Lord was worthy to die for, and he's like, I don't want to recant, I don't want to say things in my final moments
Yeah.
that dishonor the Lord. Um, and so for me, when I'm reading Ignatius or I'm reading some of these guys, I'm like, I really grab hold of some of these details
Mm.
and think, wow, um, I want to share in that faith, that
Mm.
level of commitment, the lordship of Christ that
Mm.
uh, commands my life and my death.
Mm.
Right. Obviously there's lots of good things to pull from apostolic fathers, but that's something that pops into my mind whenever you're
Yeah,
asking.
that is so cool. Well, Jamie, is there anything else you want to get off your mind on this topic that you have in mind?
Um, well, I think I've thrown out some works. I've thrown out some works already.
Yeah.
Uh, there's all sorts of different ebbs of this conversation, different directions that you could go. Other guys that you could look into, maybe Craig Evans, Jesus in the Manuscripts. There are lots of very interesting arguments. People who have thought very deeply about this conversation. Pay attention to footnotes,
Mm.
like that sort of thing. But no, I think, uh, yeah.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you all for listening to us nerd out and talk for about an hour. And hope you all have a wonderful day. And like and subscribe to Everyday Mythos. And Jamie, once again, amazing having you here today.
Oh, thanks, Paxton.
Awesome. Hopefully, we can do something like this again sometime.
I look
for another
forward to that.
subject. Awesome.
Yeah.
We'll see y'all next time.
Take care.